Okay. So today we'll be talking with Arthur Gottlieb about Grand Central Terminal. This is our third presentation in the New York City Architecture series. The next one is coming up in 2 weeks, which is April 13th, and that one is going to be the Brooklyn Bridge. If you received the Zoom invitation and you're here today, that means you're automatically registered for the rest of the series. If you don't want to come to one program or you can't make it, don't cancel your registration unless you want to cancel it for all of them. If you can't make it, that's fine. Just don't come and we'll just keep you on that list. We'll keep sending you the Zoom invitations. We'd really like to encourage questions, comments, stories. I know after the last couple of sessions, I got a lot of really cool personal history stories from people and a couple of questions. We really like hearing those throughout the presentation. So always feel free to put that in the chat box, which is down below, or you can use the raise hand feature. Both Arthur and I see that right away. You can also use your microphone to ask questions. We just ask that you get our attention first because there's a major delay between when you start speaking and when we can actually hear you. We'll also have time at the end to talk about anything that you want to talk about. We'll do questions, stories, anything you want. I'm here to introduce Arthur Gottlieb, a local historian on subjects of political and military history. He was formerly a professional curator of naval history and the technical director of exhibits at the Intrepid. He's now a counselor and certified senior advisor. He worked extensively with veterans in both positions, still works with veterans, and he himself was previously an auxiliary officer of the U.S. Coast Guard. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you so much. You give the best introductions.
Thank you. A lot of practice. Oh,
I'm always feeling when you're done, I'm always like, I should just quit while I'm ahead here, you know?
And of course, I forgot the most important one that we just talked about. Before we let everybody in from the weight room, Arthur and I decided on doing another kind of bonus program. We're going to be talking about the war in Ukraine on Monday, April 18th at 2 p.m. We just figured it out, so I haven't even put it online yet. But while we're in the presentation, I'll put it online and I'll send out that Zoom information to everybody who's in this one. You can register for it, but you don't have to because I'll just send everybody that Zoom information. That'll be Monday, the 18th, 2 p.m. And now you can go.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna go to share screen. We'll get right into it. And here is my Grand Central presentation. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Yep, you're all good.
Yep. All right, so this is a good one because like many things from New York, it reminds me of, you know, something that I did every day for literally decades, which was commute into the city. There was one point where I didn't have to take the train anymore because I got important or something, and I got my own place to park at the place I was working. So, but for many years, I took the train in and right into Grand Central. So many of you, even though I'm not going to ask you individually, it's safe to assume there's a percentage of the audience at least that had these experiences of commuting in. So for those of you who haven't, this will be a history. And for those of you who have, this is going to be some remembrance for you also. Starting off here with just the big clock on the front of Grand Central. And the building behind, of course, all of this is the MetLife building, formerly the Pan Am building. And I'm going to tell you the whole history of that also, as far as how the Pan Am building got shoehorned in there behind Grand Central. All right. Here's one of these things, Grand Central, where if you're even like I was, there's something that you walk past every single day, or you're involved in commuting through and you've already got your mind on either getting home or going to work. And many of the details architecturally were something that you might not have focused on. And so today is going to be like essentially like a historical walking tour. And we're gonna revisit some of the details. Here's a great old picture. I love this one. And the reason I stuck this one in here, not just because I love old pictures, is to remind you and I that architecturally speaking, when buildings are designed, they're designed heavily with lighting in mind, outside lighting, ambient lighting. Certainly during a time where, you know, electricity was brand new, as was the case in 1913 when this version of Grand Central was open to the public. And the difference now, of course, Grand Central and other structures are surrounded by tall buildings and greatly affects the ambient light coming into the Great Hall. And that's something that, you know, who even thinks about that? But it is a real consideration when we're looking at it this way. You know, the building was designed to have a certain amount of light coming into it for the latitude that it is on Earth. And during different seasons, you get a lot of outside lighting. Now, of course, a lot of that is cut out, like I said, from the tall buildings that are literally have crowded in Grand Central, like so many of the other structures that have survived, that are historic structures. At least the building is still there. In the time that this photograph was taken, to compensate for the fact that it was relatively dark inside the building, and to get this specific effect, the photographer had to leave the shutter open in a time-elapsed photograph. And that's why the people in the foreground are blurry. So here's a picture. I got this from an old postcard, and it shows Grand Central Terminal, right? Now, this is actually the third station that is at this specific location on 42nd Street, sitting right on top of Park Avenue, right? So Park Avenue is bisected by this building. So to the north of this, you have Park Avenue North. To the south of this, you have Park Avenue South, all right? And to make a bridge for 42nd Street, which is, if you can see where my arrow is, they had to elevate this access way here. And for those of you who spent any time down here, this is the same exact double span bridge that has been there since 1912, and it's called Pershing Square. And Pershing Square after, of course, the general who was in charge of the American Expeditionary Force that led our forces into fighting in France during World War I. Now, interestingly enough, in this photograph also on 42nd Street I got better pictures of this, but there's an elevated train here, right, which was part of the elevated train system, right? And that was a spur that came straight down 42nd Street, so one could be deposited right in front of Grand Central Station, right? Part of our story today about Grand Central is how all of the trains, whether they be trains that went in and out of Grand Central or what was later to become the subway, got put underground. So this is a building that reflected the technology of the day, which meant that finally trains could be put underground. So you got Vanderbilt Avenue on one side, and if you follow 42nd Street a little bit further east, it takes you right to Lexington Avenue. And on the corner there is the Chrysler building, right? So here is our person of the day in the late 19th century, Cornelius Vanderbilt, a railroad tycoon. Cornelius Vanderbilt would be, the equivalent of somebody like maybe a Mark Zuckerberg or somebody like that today, as far as the railroads were the major entities of the day. They had power, you might say they had a monopoly. They had a product that was never going to go out of style. And if somebody said that by 1960, the New York Central Railroad would be bankrupt, it would be like saying right now that Mark Zuckerberg would be broke. It's incomprehensible. But in fact, that's what happened. And who knows? I don't think I'm going to be alive then, but if the same amount of period goes by, maybe Mark Zuckerberg will be broke. I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime, though. Nor do I bear any animus towards him. I don't want to misrepresent what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that one day's necessity may become obsolete by something yet unforeseen. And that's, of course, what happened to the New York Central Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad and all of the other major railroad lines in the country. But Cornelius Vanderbilt was a real entrepreneur, and he had a lock on all of the train traffic in and out of New York City, and essentially built 3 major lines emanating out of New York to points north, through the Bronx and into Westchester County and beyond. And those are the lines that I took, one on the Hudson line and one on the New Haven line, were the 2 places I lived. In one time I lived on the Hudson River, the rest of the time I lived by the Long Island Sound. So, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was communicating with real estate people and everything else like that. And essentially his railroad and Grand Central made it possible to build the suburbs in Westchester County, or even the Bronx for that matter, what they are. So there you go. Here's the first station on that spot, 42nd Street. And this is really, I want you to notice something. It's hard to tell perhaps where you're sitting, but this is not a deep building, all right? Maybe 50, 60 feet deep, that's it. It's really one plane alongside 42nd Street, and everything behind this building is what is a big train shed, an above ground train shed in the European style, right? Because in 1880, trains weren't yet electrified, which means that they had to operate on coal primarily. And you can imagine what that would have been like in a tunnel, or a series of tunnels. Everybody would have been dead by the time you got to where you were going. But this is the first station on that spot. You had a Grand Central Depot, and you had Grand Central Station. The terminal that we're talking about today, the one that's there now, is Grand Central Terminal, right? Because these 3 lines essentially terminate here at this station, right? So, and of course, those are the New York and New Haven Railroad, right? Which is what we refer to as Metro North, and or the line going to the New Haven line. And then up the center, and this is a line that goes up past like Bronxville and White Plains. That's the New York and Harlem Railroad, right? And then the one here on the left is the Hudson line, which the train tracks go all the way up the Hudson River. If you've ever traveled across the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is no longer the Tappan Zee Bridge. Now it's, of course, the Honorable Mario Cuomo Bridge. And that train line goes right underneath that bridge. Take a look at this in the foreground. It kind of looks like the Old West here. You've got all of these horses and horse-drawn carriages here. You even have a trolley system before electrification that is being pulled by horses, you see. And the ground itself is not pavement or anything else like that, because when you had horses, you needed something a little easier on the hoof. Now, this building essentially was rebuilt 1899, and here is what the second Grand Central looked like, right? They made it a little bit bigger, they made it more modern. Notice how the head of Park Avenue South here has been cleaned up. It looks very clean, looks very urbanized, very Parisian to my eye. The train shed that's behind this is still there. And I'm going to give you an indication of what that looks like in a moment. You have all your horses and everything else like that. You can imagine the sounds and the smells of the day. This archway over here on the right side of the building goes down the east side of the train shed and essentially leads you to Park Avenue North. But in 1899, you already had electricity. Edison had already created his experiment down in Lower Manhattan. And you have the practical application of electricity, not just for lighting, but the first real commercial enterprise where electricity was to have a major impact was in the transportation system of the day, in the form of creating a robust electric motor connected to the chassis of a train, where it could actually drive the train car. And as you know, as we discuss in many things even today regarding the environment, electricity consumes no oxygen. And as a result of its doing work, it gives off no noxious fumes or combustible, or not combustible rather, but CO2, you see. So now finally you have something you can put underground that is safe for passengers. Change the whole world. There we go. And so this is what the average steam locomotive used to look like. You know, steam power in our country, in North America, because I mean Canada especially, we used steam locomotives into the 1950s only because of World War II. Before World War II, train power was going to be completely replaced. Steam power was going to be replaced with all diesel locomotives, right? So you have these big diesel engines that drive these electric motors, and the generators, and the generators create electrical current, which drives the train. It can actually pull a whole train.
Did you know that?
So anyway, so here you have obviously something that you can take this and pull it through a mountain tunnel where it's only a certain amount of time you're going to be in there. But you can't have an underground train system with this kind of billowing smoke going on, obviously, you see? Okay, now I want you to see if you can get your bearings here. Remember the train shed I was telling you about? The train shed behind the original two Grand Centrals went from 42nd Street to approximately 46th Street, right? It was a huge train shed. Imagine like an airplane hangar to give you an idea of the size of it. And so this photograph was taken from the top of the north face of that train shed, looking northeast. And if you can see this opening between these shadowy buildings in the background here, that is Park Avenue North, right there, you see? So the trains would come straight down Park Avenue North, the same way they do today, but instead of it all being underground, this is all above ground, you see? And since it's a commuter railroad by nature, you have to have a backup of a lot of trains. So that means if you're getting on the 4:15 and there's going to be another train 20 minutes later that's going to be leaving, you have to have a lot of backup trains for the commute, you see? So as soon as one leaves the station, another one can come in and that one would fill up as well. You see, so the question is, where do you put all these trains that are ready to go? Well, all of these trains still exist in like a giant train yard, but you don't see it anymore because this train yard is underground. And not only is it underground, but remarkably for the day, it's on 2 levels, right? So you've got a train yard above another train yard, and the whole thing compresses through track switching. And then you wind up with 4 tracks going down Park Avenue North. You see, it's really kind of incredible. I'll give you a different perspective here in another moment. And that's what Park Avenue North looked like, you see. Used to be called 4th Avenue. Now it's Park Avenue, 1875, right? So when you come down to Grand Central from points north, you're coming down an enclosed train tunnel that has 4 tracks, which are the same tracks that were there originally as in this etching, you see? It's the only difference is that it's not covered. Now, if you use your imagination, if you know what Park Avenue North looks like, you can easily see how this center section is covered, and they've got gardens here and ventilation grates and all the rest of that. And then really, what you've got here, the traffic travels up Park Avenue northbound on this side, and it travels down Park Avenue southbound on this side. So those of you who are familiar with this area can probably imagine this pretty easily. I used to work right over here on 51st Street and Park Avenue North, so I was here all the time. And, of course, you've got the Waldorf Astoria also, which doesn't exist, of course, in this photograph. Yeah. You see, now, from the north face of the train shed, where it goes out into that outside train yard, this is looking south within the train shed. Now, if you've ever seen Parisian movies and things like that, where, in different places in Europe, they have, these big train sheds. And that's essentially what this was. And you can see how they have these skylights here to add ambient lights. It was kind of like a big airplane hangar before they had big airplanes, you see? And this is what Grand Central looked like. So if you were commuting, you would come in from 42nd Street, you'd go through the building and it would bring you out here. And this would be the train platforms where they bring the trains in for the trains that were about to be leaving or the ones who had just arrived. And, it was innovative for the day because they had raised platforms, right? So you would, like today, we take it for granted that, you step right from the platform onto the train, right? But as soon as you got out of Grand Central and you went to all of these little train stations around, somebody had to put a little stairs there so you could step off the train down to ground level. And if you look at any of the old original train stations, well, certainly where I live, I get on the train in Westport, and the original train station there is on the ground level. So you have to step up the stairs to get onto the platform. So now you're at the same level as the train. But of course, in the old days, they used a ladder to get on the train itself. Right now, looking in the opposite direction from the 42nd Street part looking straight north out of the train shed. This is what it looks like. You're looking straight up Park Avenue, you see, except there's a train yard out there. And see, this is where all of the commuter trains are. And then it leaves this facade here with all of these arches, an arch for each one of the tracks, right? And now what I'm going to do in the next photograph is I'm going to show you what it looks like from the outside looking in from the train yard looking south again, right? So keep your eye on these arches over here. See? And that's what it looks like from the outside train yard looking towards the back of the building, which is really the north face of it. And I lifted this photograph from a publication, a historic publication called Architectural Ironworker, right? And it was another thing here architecturally. You see this whole facade here? This was like a cast iron edifice. And that was sort of like an architectural thing. If you're an architecture geek, you can go down to places in New York, like around south of Houston Street, right? Or Soho, where it gets that name. And they have these old commercial buildings that are actually have these cast iron facades, right? And so this was kind of like this big ornate thing. It's pretty cool, really. If you can see towards the top, it says erected in 1871, right? And here's a good, and this is the train yard. This is the train yard. And, you know, you've got an old lamp over here that's probably a carbon arc lamp or a gas light or something like that. You see, and to give you a perspective, you can see, I don't know if you can see this person standing here, but it gives you a sense of the scale of things, right? And this whole thing here, right, is the train shed. So 42nd Street, you could just see the back of that original Grand Central over here to the mid left of the photograph on the left frame, left towards the left side of the frame here. And then, so I would say that this face over here was probably around the equivalent of 45th Street. And watch how the New York Central lines turned this whole thing into a major business, turned into a major business. Now, if you wanted to get into, to go anywhere, frankly, you weren't going to get in your car and get on I-95 or something like that. I mean, you know, you had to take the train. That's how people got around. And so you want to have a grand train station, and that's going to bring people into New York, and everybody was going to make money from tourism, from travel, et cetera, et cetera. Transportation is part of American history about how our country has changed and things like that. So look at this advertisement for the, essentially, they're bragging about the new Grand Central Station, and I would be too if I was the New York Central lines. It's a big deal, right? The new Grand Central Terminal, New York City, the 4 great sites of the East, right? So you can see New York, the world's metropolis, right? Boston, the hub of the universe. The famous 20th Century Limited, right, which is the name of one of the trains that they had, the new Grand Central Terminal, right? I remember one of my audiences, being the snarky New York kid that I am, I said, you know, facetiously, I said, Boston. I didn't know Boston was the hub of the universe, right? And there was obviously a person from Boston in the office, in the audience. And he said, he got up and he said, you bet your ass it's the hub of the universe. You know, it was funny as hell. It was a good, you know, New York, Boston thing. So, and you can see all these other places you can get to from, of course, Grand Central eventually, right? You can connect to virtually anywhere. And that's the only way you were getting anywhere, is with the train. Now, this is kind of a grainy photograph. I can't help that. It's from 1888, all right? And 1888 was a very significant thing because 1888, they had this massive, massive snowstorm that shut everything down. And it really brings to the forefront the necessity to have a major transportation system like the New York transportation system. And if you could get this underground somehow, that was a big dream, to create a subway system underground. And Boston, once again, was the first to do it. And there was this race for who was going to get it done. And there's a tremendous amount of politics involved when you are going to have an infrastructure program like this that is essentially started off as being privately funded. So the blizzard of 1888, and what you see here is there's the back of Grand Central, which is the north face of it. And it's everybody who normally works on the trains to keep them running is there shoveling snow. And it just shut the whole city down. Now, of course, that everything's underground, it really doesn't matter if it's snowing outside. Here's another shot. It's a good picture. This is right in front of Grand Central, right? So there's the right side of that original depot right over here. And there's that opening that I was showing you that leads to the east side of the building down towards Park Avenue North, all right? Or the train actually is going to take you to where the train yard is. And here's a hotel that's right at the head of Park Avenue South, right? And this is 42nd Street right here. And there is that elevated train that I was telling you about that takes you right to Grand Central, all right? So it's Park Avenue and 42nd Street in 1895, right? The termination of the 3rd Avenue spur line in the foreground, and the Grand Union Hotel is the one right here on the right side, right? And here's two fellows over here looking very handsome in their derbies. See that? And you have all of these horses, and they're all drawn by these, the carts are all drawn by these horses. Like I said, you can imagine the sights, the smells, right? And all the rest of that. Now, this is an engraving because I couldn't find a photograph of that spur line going straight to the front of Grand Central. You see it? So this is 42nd Street. And essentially behind you would be Lexington Avenue, okay, just south of 42nd Street, to give you an idea of where we're looking. And you can see to good effect here how this is the front of Grand Central, and all of this, which is essentially north-south, is that giant train shed. It's enormous. It's like a giant airplane hangar. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. You see, now you can see how New York Central has partnered up with real estate entities. And they've turned the whole thing, this business of commuting to the northern suburbs, in this case, as a tremendous lucrative business, right? If you could get people to move to the suburbs, before anybody knew what a suburb was, by the way, and you would sell property, you would sell everything, towns would pop up, and there would be all of the different businesses to support people living in essentially two locations. One location during the day down in New York City, and another location for the rest of the time up in wherever you were. And so this one here is referring to the Center line, right? Or the Harlem line that goes straight up, like I said, to Mount Vernon, Bronxville, Tuckahoe, Crestwood, Scarsdale, Hartsdale, White Plains, North White Plains. You see, and electric train service now, right? And the new Grand Central terminal was all electric, right? So that's why everything is underground. This solves the problem of living both in the city and out of it. It is only a matter of a few more minutes in the cars to secure lower rents or your own home or farm, with sure and easy access to the life of the great city when desired. You keep the city income, and make only the country expenditures, right? So I think things have grown up a little bit. I wouldn't exactly say my expenses here are country expenditures. Okay, so anyway, send for a booklet. Remember, this is before the internet, right? You can't do this on your smartphone. Suburban Homes on the New York Central Lines, which tells all about available homes, gives complete list of real estate dealers in its territory, as well as the territory served by the Hudson River and Putnam Division and the West Shore Railroad, right? Blah, blah, blah. And this is from the newspaper that existed during that day called The Sun, and it was Sunday, April 3rd, 1910. And the new Grand Central, the one that's there now, Grand Central Terminal, was building at that time. So out of the city, you know, wherever you were coming from, this is really probably what your train station looked like, unless you were, you know, coming from some other medium to large city. You know, I was born in New York City, but when I was very young, my parents moved to the just a rock's throw from the Bronx in a place called South New Rochelle, where my father opened up his own business. And so when my mother used to go down to the city, and she liked, you know, all kinds of cultural things, and my father really didn't. And so my mom would go down, and if she wanted to go see the museum or see something, she had to go by herself. And as a very young person, even before I was in elementary school, she used to take me. She dragged me along when I was a kid. It was kind of like a boon for me because I loved it, you know. And this is what the train station looked like in New Rochelle back in that day. As a matter of fact, if you go to I was just mentioning the Westport train station, in restored fashion, it didn't look much different from this. And I remember that they had this skinny guy behind the counter wearing his blue uniform with his stiff round hat, right? It looked like a turret with a sort of like a beak on it, you know, with a brass plaque on the front. And the dude had a mustache, you know, and it wasn't just any mustache, it was the railroad guy mustache, you know. And I loved it. And, you know, my mother bought tickets, and then he would take, he had this like puncher, and he would punch the tickets, right? And then when you got on the train and the guy came to collect your tickets, he would punch your tickets. And if you were astute at noticing things like I was, and I would like to think still am, this guy's punch was a different shape than the guy on the train, you see. And I like things like that. So anyway, now that everything's getting electrified, all of this has to be torn down. There's a train shed being demolished, and all of this, the train yard, the train shed, it's going to be underground, right? Scientific American magazine of 1912, this was a period of time where it seemed like, in fact, there was a mastery of mechanical things. Okay, the understanding of how to machine steel, how to create various kinds of apparatus and machinery, that it seemed as though there was nothing left to invent practically. All right, and it was a time celebrated for its achievement in mechanical things and a real confidence that man had kind of mastered the universe. 1912 was an important year. And here's the newest, you know, wonder of the world, the fabulous Grand Central Terminal. Another thing in 1912 that was considered a modern marvel, to borrow a phrase, was the RMS Titanic, you see, which was kind of a cold, wet towel in the face of being too arrogant about having mastered the universe, if you can see what I mean. Now, this is a fanciful kind of a drawing, and really what it is, it's a cutaway of Grand Central, the complex. And I like this because I want to show or remind to talk to you about the complexity of the urban city, in the sense of that if you were to drill a hole down 100, 200 feet underneath a place like Grand Central, there would be things operating 200 feet down below the street level. You'd have, if not tunnels, you would have train tracks. If not train tracks, you would have other transportation systems. You would have sewage pipes, you would have water pipes, you would have steam pipes, you would have natural gas pipes, you would have conduit for electricity. You would have, maintenance crawl spaces. You would have all sorts of things. You would have, drainage, everything. It's just incredible how built the city is below the structures that you see. If you are interested in this kind of thing, it truly is incredible. Now watch this. Okay, so here's where we are. Let me give you your perspective. We are on Park Avenue North, okay? Before there's a Park Avenue North proper. And we're looking south, directly south. And this is the back of Grand Central, right? That is the back of Grand Central. If you don't recognize it, don't be alarmed, because this building here no longer exists. This is the building of Grand Central that was torn down to make room for the Pan Am / MetLife building. See that? It's just incredible. And what they've done here, that entire train yard, right, with 50 tracks astride, has now been completely excavated down 75, 80 feet below the street level, or what's going to be the street level. And they are building now an entire labyrinth of these iron and wrought iron structures, which are going to be a boxed tunnel for the lower set of trains, and then on top of it, a secondary set of trains above it, you see? And these abutments down over here, going all the way down to the ground, what's now going to be the ground level, is literally what holds up the street and the rest of the city to this day. It's pretty incredible. And remember, all of this is done without computer-aided design or anything else like that. It's a bunch of architects with sharp pencils and knowledge of mathematics, etc. Right now, this is looking in the opposite direction. Oh, say we're looking north, but we're looking one click west of dead north, you see? So you can see how where that surface train yard used to be. Here's the surface, by the way. You can imagine, see, the bottom of this building is approximately here. And everything here now is going to be completely underground. You see how far they had to dig down here to bring these trains in? And what's also good about this photograph is you can see back in these days, this is circa 1909, 1910, they didn't have a lot of large buildings blocking the view. So can you see St. Patrick's Cathedral right over here towards the upper left of the photograph? I think that's a neat picture. Okay, here's another one. Okay, so now we're looking north again. And I want to show you this. You see, so when you come in to Grand Central, you're essentially coming in this cage right over here. And then there's another cage above it, right? And this is all under the street level. You see, so this entire train yard with all of these other tracks are completely under the street level now. And it's just amazing. It's like you know, it's like kind of like cutting the Panama Canal in the sense, you know, without it being a canal. Anyway, so here's the face of the finished Grand Central Terminal, 1913, there's that spur for the elevated train right over here in the forefront, right? And that's looking west down 42nd Street, okay? Now, remember I told you there was two arches that went over, and well, one of the arches goes over 42nd Street anyway. The reason they had to build that elevated roadway was to link up Park Avenue South. They had to bring it up. They had to raise it, go over 42nd Street. If you can see my arrow. Because one of the innovative things about Grand Central is that it has a roadway completely around the building, one level up from the street level, you see? And you will probably aware of this if you've ever taken a cab down Park Avenue. They have to take that roadway to go around Grand Central. Because remember I said that Park Avenue sits smack on top of Park Avenue, you see? So the idea was that you bring cars up the elevated level, and then you can go around Grand Central on the one level up from 42nd Street. I'm just reading something that popped up on my screen. And then you emerge back out onto Park Avenue North, right? If you've ever taken a cab that way, you'll know what I'm talking about. Right, so there you go. There's another picture of the front of Grand Central. And that's that little sign that says Pershing Square right over here. Now, this clock, this is Grand Central Terminal's 13-foot clock surrounded by Jules Couton's sculpture of Mercury, the god of commerce, Minerva, Hercules, and the American symbol of the eagle. Very symbolic, right? Anybody ever look up there to see what time it was? No, me neither. You see, so to good effect here, you can see that elevated road that goes all the way around Grand Central. You see, it's one full level up from 42nd Street. Here's Vanderbilt Avenue, right? And you see, remember that building I told you about that we saw when we were looking south? That I said doesn't exist anymore, that is right here, right? So it was a whole bunch of offices and things like that that were part of the Grand Central complex. And this is what got torn down, and they shoehorned in, and I mean shoehorned in, the Pan Am building, which is right up against the back of Grand Central. Now, this building up here to the upper left, this was actually a companion building to Grand Central, you see? The whole thing was designed so that the citizen could look at Grand Central, and the vision of it would be accompanied by this companion building in the back, which was the New York Central building, right? When I was commuting here, it was no longer the New York Central building. It was the Helmsley building. Remember Leona Helmsley? Sure you do. And so anyway, the Pan Am building, or the MetLife building as it is now, completely obscures this building. You can't see it, of course, because it's like a big monolith, the Pan Am building stuck right in there. You know, so the original design of what this was all supposed to look like is completely obliterated by the MetLife building, let alone a lot of other buildings that are just torn down here, and these, you know, big glass and aluminum office towers put up in their stead. You see, so you can see clearly the roadway that goes around both sides Grand Central here, okay? And then that converges and then comes out and emerges through the New York Central building out onto Park Avenue North. And here is a picture of the upper roadway, right? This is Vanderbilt Avenue to your right here. We're looking south. And this building, this big white building in front, that's still there, or at least it was a few weeks ago. And to the right over here, right in here, is a great Irish restaurant called Annie Moore's. I don't know if you've ever been, if you have a hankering for bangers and mash or something, I recommend it. Now, follow me on this slide here, right? So Lexington Avenue, Park Avenue North, Madison Avenue, okay? This is Grand Central right over here where my arrow is on towards the right of your slide. You see, there is the New York Central building, right? Now this is from the 1930s, so there's no Pan Am building there. If there was a Pan Am building, it would be right here. This is the thing that got torn down right here. You see, so you'll recognize perhaps that on Park Avenue North, remember I was talking about the Waldorf Astoria? There's the Waldorf, right? Where did the Waldorf used to be before it was here? It used to be where the Empire State Building is, okay? The Empire State Building, the Waldorf Astoria was demolished, the old one, so that the Empire State Building could be built where the Empire State Building is built. And this is the new Waldorf right over here, see? Now, notice that part of the slide is darkened, and the buildings that are highlighted in the lighter gray color is what I'm after here. Now, remember I told you that the trains come down Park Avenue, 4 tracks right down the center of Park Avenue. The area that is in light gray shows the area of New York City, Manhattan, that is built over the train yard. You see, so everywhere that's light gray colored here is built literally over a massive train yard. The train yard that used to be all on the surface, open, like in those earlier photographs I showed you, right? And whoever knew that, right? You see, so this gives you a good example, this slide here showing you the extensive track level, right? I mean, so you've got 2 levels of tracks. Here's Grand Central Complex to the left here, right? Now, this is a big deal. This is the biggest, the Grand Central, even to this day, has more train platforms where you can get on the trains than any other train station anywhere. It's got 44 separate platforms on 2 levels, all right? 67 separate tracks. And that's how they did it. It's all underground. And you've got these turnaround tracks and everything. You can imagine the logistics and like call it choreography, if you will, to make, you know, to literally run a railroad. You know, I spoke to an elderly woman the other day. You know, I made a home visit. This lady's husband used to work for the railroad, right? So she's got a lot of these little railroad jokes. And I asked her, she's being taken care of her adult daughter. So she's always got a good sarcasm about her adult daughter, about how she's being pushed around and told what to do by her adult daughter, which isn't completely untrue. But so I asked her, I said, how you doing? I said to the senior lady, right, who's going to be 90 years old. And she goes, well, Art, I don't run the railroad. I'm just on the tracks, which I thought was kind of funny, frankly. And I hope you do too. Anyway, so here's looking down Park Avenue. And, you know, it doesn't look a lot different than it does now, with the exception that these buildings on the right side and on the left side are mostly gone. And they're replaced with these big old aluminum and glass office towers, right? And you see these 2 arches here. This is where the traffic reconverges in like this S-turn inside the New York Central building, and then emerges onto Park Avenue North, right? And in the center here, what you're looking at, this is covered, a covering over those 4 tracks that were the original tracks, essentially, and the tracks that are still there now, you see? And this doesn't look a whole lot different, except the buildings are different. And this is a photograph from 1929. And like I said, now this is the Helmsley building, right? Now, I used to walk down Park Avenue every single day to where I worked on Park Avenue, 51st Street. So you see, before the New York Central building even was built, right? This is the street. This is Park Avenue North. these two lanes right over here. This would be the lane going for northbound traffic and for southbound traffic. And you can see that they've already covered the 4 tracks, right? And you can see underneath where the buildings are going to go, the buildings that are in this photograph, you can see that it's all built on top of 2 separate layers of tracks, right, that are leading into Grand Central. It's absolutely unbelievable, really. And there's that opening that I was telling you about, these 2 oval-shaped, these arched openings, right? And then that's for the vehicular traffic. And then you have these 2, rectangular portals here for, pedestrians going through the Helmsley building. To me, I walk through those every day going to Grand Central. And it was kind of creepy because, they had all these huge posters of Leona Helmsley back in those days, and like laying on the couch, like in this sexy sort of pose. And, forgive me for not thinking that Leona Helmsley was attractive in a sexual fashion, at least not to me. So I just found myself walking faster and faster and get the hell out of there, And anyway, so here's a telephoto shot, meaning with a large lens on a camera, and you can see how it's compressed between the Couton's statue of Minerva, etc. And I just wanted to show you the top of the New York Central building, which was really very beautiful. It still is. I mean, you can only see it from the other side, of course, and it's very nice, very like Louis XVI kind of these dormers, right? There's a lot of the details in the top of these buildings you can't even ever see. With the job I had that I used to pay my way through graduate school, was building like mahogany law libraries and information filing systems back before, people still had files, like if somebody said, please get me this file, you actually went somewhere and opened a file cabinet, you came back with a paper file, right? That's how old I am. And so anyway, what I liked about that job is I was in hundreds of buildings in mid-Manhattan and down by Wall Street, and up on the 51st floor of whatever building it was, you could look across the street and see to good detail how beautiful the architecture was high up on the opposite side of the street, on the building on the opposite side of the street. That was something I'll never forget, and really one of the reasons why I did it. So, plus I needed the money. So anyway, inside Grand Central, you'll notice that the original interior of Grand Central, whereas now they have a staircase on both sides inside Grand Central. That was part of the original design of the building, but it wasn't completed that way. It was only completed with the staircase and the balcony on one side of the building. And the other side was essentially slab-sided, right? And that's the way you can see it now. And this used to be the lost and found over here. And you can see they always use it for some kind of advertising. So, I would gauge this photograph, even though it's not dated, from around 1940, because you can see that they're promoting the war effort in the sale of defense bonds and all the rest of that. And also you can imagine the tremendous amount of military personnel coming through a place like Grand Central Terminal. These places were open 24 hours a day, and defense personnel had a priority of transportation. So Grand Central and Pennsylvania Station were hopping. This was the peak of train traffic in the United States. By early 1950s, it was already precipitously dropping off. Anyway, so you can see these are all like 1940 era hardware, and you've got your sailor and your soldier here, etc. Yeah, that's a repeat. Now, after World War II, the reason why train traffic dropped off the way it did, and you can see here, this is in the 1960s, because this is Motor Trend's 1966 car of the year, this Rambler. You see it? The Rambler station wagon, right? So by 1966, the New York Central lines was already bankrupt. Pennsylvania Railroad was bankrupt. Remember Penn Central? I remember that when I was a young man, very young, 1966. I mean, hell, 1966, I was only 8 years old, but it was, I remember the logos on the trains changing because all of the railroad lines had to merge. They had to consolidate or go out of business, right? And they were broke, right? I mean, they couldn't even barely keep the lights on in places like Grand Central Terminal. And by 1966, the Great Pennsylvania Station was torn down unceremoniously, okay? Only leaving the track system that was below ground to begin with. So that magnificent train station of Pennsylvania Station is no more and replaced by the unelegant, in my opinion, Madison Square Garden. You see? So people who have gone down, I mean, the New York Times ran stories about that, editorials, saying because it was clear when Penn Station was being torn down, it put New York City in a state of shock for anybody who, wasn't living under a rock. You didn't even have to like architecture to realize that it was a mistake, because some things that get torn down ain't never going back up, you see? And so this was the Pennsylvania Station. The destruction of it changed architecture everywhere because Penn Station was the sacrificial lamb that put everybody into overtime to figure out how not to let a mistake like that place being torn down ever happen again, you see, or at least without a fight. And Grand Central Terminal is a benefactor of that fight, you see, because Grand Central was equally expendable because the track system is equally underground to Pennsylvania Station. So people were like, well, why don't we just tear this monster down? Who needs it? People can go down the stairs and get on the train in Penn Station. There's nothing wrong with that. We need progress. And everybody's driving the automobile now. And we've got to build roads and all the rest of this. And nobody's driving the train anyway. The train is so 19th century, so it was this period of modernization that became kind of, it was incognizant of the consequences of losing architecture that can't be replaced, you see? And Penn Station was the straw that broke the camel's back on that. So the reason why all this advertising stuff is here in the middle of Grand Central, which is something, of course, that the designers, they would have had a heart attack if they saw the scrap there, is because they needed the revenue. They needed the revenue of, they had an advertising kiosk everywhere. It didn't matter. They needed every dollar they can get. And you see this, I remember this gigantic picture over here from Eastman Kodak. I remember every time I came down here with my mom, or even, as a young adult myself, this thing was still there. And it was just incredible how you could have such a large picture, now after this program, if I went over to Walmart, I'd be seeing like the average person with a 60-inch flat screen TV, and they're trying to shove it in their Hyundai or something, but back in these days, it was a big deal having a large picture like that, with that kind of resolution. It was really impressive. But they were paying a fortune to have that display there, Kodak is another thing I was talking about before, about the obsolescence of things. Whoever thought that photography, a company like Kodak, would be bankrupt, you see? And they had to sell all of their different patents and everything else like that, because they just never really anticipated that something like digital photography would ever replace film emulsion, etc. So we're looking south, And there is the Grand Central building that exists as we know it. The part that was the offices was torn down. And this is a picture of it, the fact that it was torn down. This photograph is taken from the New York Central building. And now there is a gap in between the New York Central building and Grand Central, you see. And this was torn down because it was a compromise. The idea was that here's three things we can do with the Grand Central property. Okay, we can either tear it down like Pennsylvania Station, put everything underground, and put another equally ugly building in its place. Or we can create a framework around Grand Central and build a building on top of it. That I'm sure that would have been delightful looking. Or we could tear down half of Grand Central, the office parts, and we can shoehorn in a major modern office complex, which became the Pan Am building. So this was the compromise. And that's the only reason why Grand Central still exists, you see. Other places that were on the chopping block by now were also Radio City Music Hall. Once people started having the availability of home theater, et cetera, via VCR, which is a little bit later, 10 years later, but, movie going fell off precipitously. And how do you keep the doors open if you don't have a lot of people going in to see a movie? So Radio City Music Hall was another structure that was going to be completely demolished, at least the interior of it, and they were going to build God knows what. And I'm very, very happy that that never occurred. And there you go. There's the Pan Am building. And so you can see that, the New York Central building is there, but it's, it's in the shadow, literally, of the Pan Am building. And I always thought the Pan Am building was such a cool looking building. My uncle worked for Pan Am, so I had a little brand recognition there. And this was a building also that it was so futuristic, back in these days, this was the period of time from like the 1964-65 World's Fair, and everything is about space travel and future transportation and all of that. And you could land helicopters. This was a helicopter pad on top of the Pan Am building. I mean, how cool is that? You see? And well, it was cool until the 1970s when the landing gear on one of the copters collapsed and the helicopter fell off the building and smashed into the ground. Remarkably, I don't think anybody in the ground was killed. And after that, no more helicopters on the Pan Am building. This, of course, on the corner of Lexington Avenue, the east corner of Lexington Avenue, northeast corner, is the Chrysler building, the famous Chrysler building. And now looking up from Park Avenue South, you can see how Grand Central is like now this like diminutive thing. You see, it's kind of like overwhelmed by all of this stuff around it, in my opinion. It's not the vision that the original architects had in mind. You can't see the New York Central building anymore. You've got all of these other buildings, certainly these at least, these modern buildings that are just, monolithic in nature. And it dwarfs, I think, Grand Central. So if you follow this straight up, it takes you right over that Pershing Square Arch to Grand Central. See? So I just told you the story of Pennsylvania Station and how this is a photograph from 1923. I mean, if the Grand Central Terminal is one of the biggest tourist attractions in New York, and had Pennsylvania Station still existed, it would have probably been at least as equal an architectural destination for people who love, train stuff or just architecture of this nature. I mean, it was a magnificent building. It just unceremoniously torn down between 1963 and 1966. And where now you have Madison Square Garden. I have a whole presentation on this building here as well. It's really something one of my, I don't know, it's silly to say a regret, it's out of my control, but I always wish that I had seen Grand Central, rather Pennsylvania Station, at least once in my life, and I never did. Look at the trolleys. I've never been on a trolley in my entire life. You see, so you had a few eggheads coming down from places like Columbia and stuff, and they were like, let's not tear down Penn Station because it's going to be horrible, and you don't know what you're going to lose, but nobody was really caring, we still had a lot of stuff around that had been built earlier in the century or even in the late 19th century, and like I said, it took this trauma of the building actually being demolished, Penn Station, to create a wave of preservation activists, in the form of the New York Historical Society. And every time something has a National Historic Landmark designation, that literally was a result of the consciousness that was created primarily from the tearing down of Pennsylvania Station in New York City. But gone it was. And then by the mid-1970s, and I remind you that in the mid-1970s, this particular photograph is from 1978, but in the mid-1970s, New York City was on the verge, literally, of bankruptcy itself. You had, what was it, Abe Beam, I guess it was, and there was this famous headline, I think it was from the Daily News, where it was unprecedented for a city to ask the federal government for a bailout. And I think it was President Ford who said, we're not going to bail you out, and it was also tainted with this, well, you people in New York deserve what you get because, look at New York, it's this corrupt, hedonistic place, and, get your own house in order and don't make decent people from the rest of the country have to pay for your, your heathenistic activities, right? Mm. And so here's some preservation people that were leading the way for the saving Grand Central Terminal from being torn down. Beth Meyerson, if you remember her. This guy over here, I think his name is Philip Johnson. If I'm not mistaken, he was the designer of something called the Glass House in New Canaan. And of course, there is the famous Jackie O, who had adopted New York City as her home, and she loved it. And then, of course, there's the famous Ed Koch, right? Ed Koch. How am I doing? Right? He was the mayor for, it seemed like forever. At least when I was a kid, it seemed like he was there forever. And they were like, we can't allow another Pennsylvania station to occur. We have to make sure that Grand Central, no matter what we do, we got to reincorporate, we got to take it over, etc. And that was successful. And everything was actually reincorporated. Right, you have the New York Transportation Authority, the MTA, and all the rest of that, and now it's a National Historic Landmark, this building. And the last time that I was actually commuting into the city, they were, back in that era, they were actually finishing their restorations of this around from 1997 to 2000, that sort of thing. And the building is completely restored. It's beautiful on the interior now. And, as somebody who is a restoration specialist myself, except with military hardware, aircraft and ships and artifacts and things like that, I appreciated the care and the restoration that went into this. It's not easy. You have to figure out the proper ways to clean things like granite and marble, without damaging it. And it was filthy. The place was filthy. And not only that, but during that era where the New York Central Railroad had to find revenue any way they could, they allowed people to come up and put vending machines there and kiosks and stuff. And they weren't very careful when they had to fasten something to the wall. I don't know if you've ever drilled a hole in masonry. You need to have the proper tools and know what you're doing, you know? So a lot of these beautiful, the granite work and the marble was snapped and cracked from improper fastening and other damage. And during the restoration, the original quarries where some of this material came from was, of course, it was a different color because it was a different part of the quarry now, all these years later, 100 years later. They found the original materials and they replaced all the broken pieces. It was really something. And you've got to be able to clean up all the grime that was on the inside of the station. Right, so you've got the normal grime that's on the floor, but that's not what I'm talking about. The walls and the ceiling and all of the fixtures were filthy. It was dingy, and there was this like heavy brown film on things, and further chemical analysis revealed what it was. It was cigarette smoke. Right, you don't forget that back, you know, I watch Turner Classic Movies sometimes when I need to clear my head or something like that. And I watch these old movies from like, you know, what, the 1930s, 40s, 50s. And there isn't a moment where every single person is lighting up a cigarette, right? And that's what it all was. It was all of this heavy tar, I guess, that had just from decade after decade after decade after decade, just deposited itself on these walls. And the stuff that you used to get it off, I don't know if you ever remember, when I was a kid, they had the stuff that you bought in the toy store in an egg. It was called silly putty, right? And silly putty was actually an invention for something that had a real use in World War II. And when the war was over, they didn't have a use for it anymore. And they weren't going to waste the money on the investment of developing this product. So they turned it into a toy, right? You know, and you could take the silly putty, and back then, you know, I would take my father's newspaper and I would put the silly putty on like on the comic strip, and you can lift the silly putty off and it would have a negative transfer of whatever the image was, see. So restoration specialists use a product like silly putty like that. There's a reason I'm telling you the story, is because you can take the silly putty type material, put it on a delicate surface and peel it off. And it'll actually take the impurities off the surface without damaging the surface, right? You do that about 10,000 times and you wind up with a pristine place like this, you see, and it is pristine now. Right, there's that big annunciator. I used to stand there and watch this when it was old, the original one. It was like, you remember the old digital clocks when the time would change and like the number would flap over, you know? That's an electromagnetic mechanism. And that's what, it was just phenomenal how this thing, every 30 seconds or so, it would go, right? And it would have all of these different, you know, it would update the train schedule. What had already left, what's late, etc. So this is now a modern one. When you have a National Historic Landmark like Grand Central Terminal, it's okay to update to something like this to a digital format, but it has to look like the original or as close to the original as possible. Now there's a restaurant down here called the Oyster Bar. I don't know if you've ever eaten there. I've never eaten there. I've passed by it a million times. And, you know, I didn't have the time or the money for stuff like this back in those days. And but it's this wonderful kind of archway. It's just like this big restaurant at Grand Central on a lower level. And it is this, this tile work is emblematic of many things that you see in the architecture of New York. It's a herringbone pattern of terracotta tiles, and they're called Gustavino tiles. It's absolutely beautiful. You see it if you know what you're looking at in a lot of different places. Now there's the Oyster Bar restaurant where my arrow is. And here's a couple of ramps that take you to this flat, this perfect square in front of where the Oyster Bar restaurant is, right? And because of the hemispherical shape of the ceiling and the reflectivity of the terracotta and all the rest of that, there's a kind of a phenomenon that occurs here, an auditory phenomenon. And if see where this fellow is standing up here in this corner. Now, if I was standing on the opposite corner, right, directly across, The phenomenon is that if I was to say something, even in a whisper, he would be able to hear everything I just said, right? It's the sound acoustics right in that spot. And this photograph is also good because it shows how Grand Central Terminal was very ahead of its day by incorporating the massive use of ramps, right? There's no stairs. Pennsylvania Station had stairs all over the place, you see, but Grand Central utilized ramps as an efficient way to move people without having to walk upstairs, you see. Here's a good example of that same staircase going down, right? And you know, it's a black and white photograph, but it's still a brilliant photograph. Now, lighting is very important. As I told you, the ambient lighting, et cetera. Now, Grand Central was a major public place that was going to use extensive use of electricity, obviously. And I don't know if you were aware, but lighting is very important as far as any kind of architectural consideration. You know, the fixtures that are used, the type of lighting that's used. Now, back in those days, they didn't have many choices. The only thing you had is the regular light bulb, which is called an A19 Edison lamp, right? With a tungsten filament that gives off a incandescent or something that's incandescing, which is burning. It's almost like the same color as a fire, you know, and it tends to warm things in the red tones. And it's a very pleasing light. It's always, my brain likes this kind of light bulb, even though they're not very efficient, okay? And I don't like things that are more on the blue spectrum, like they have a lot of these modern LED lights and, you know, these bright white lights. It's just not good for, my brain doesn't like it, okay? So these are bronze fixtures, and they're designed with the A19 bulbs in mind, which was this then called the Edison bulb. And it's all designed to be complementary to each other, right? And there's hundreds of these fixtures. And they still use the plain old light bulbs. You see, even these gigantic pendants that hang from the ceiling, that lower so you can surface them, are all regular light bulbs. You see, now I remember, you know, when I was commuting back and forth, they were just coming into, you know, energy consciousness after, you know, the 1970s, et cetera. You know, how do we save electricity? And they had, remember those squiggly light bulbs, right? And all the rest of that. And I remember in Grand Central, I was always praying that they wouldn't, as some nod to environmentalism, not that I'm knocking environmentalism, I didn't want them to put those squiggly bulbs all throughout Grand Central Station because they have thousands of these regular light bulbs. And I thought it would have looked terrible. And they didn't. They waited until they had something that was the same color temperature, in other words, the color, and that same shape. That was truly efficient. And I applaud them for that. Right? So here's a guy who's testing all the new light bulbs before they actually pull the thing back up to the proper height. See? It's beautiful. Man, if I had a dime for every time I was down these escalators and up these escalators. The clock, probably the second most famous clock anywhere, only to Big Ben, right? By the way, Big Ben is the tower isn't Big Ben, the clock is Big Ben, all right? And so the big clock over here, when I was already in the city every day. So, you know, if I used to get complimentary tickets as a perk of my job to Carnegie Hall all the time. And I would invite my wife to come down to take the train down, and we'd go over to Carnegie Hall. And where would I meet her? I met her at the clock, right? A lot of memories. Then the famous ceiling, right? This beautiful, like, aquamarine teal color. It's just stunning color. I love that color, right? It has a depiction of the zodiac across it, right? Now, I've never known much about, you know, the zodiac or astronomy or anything else like that. It's just never was one of my interests. But, they have these star constellations that are, you have certain bright stars, and they became certain, depictions of what people from years back used to look up, and they used to see different things like a Pegasus, right? And in the ceiling, actually, they have recessed lights that are showing you what the stars are in this particular constellation, or whatever you would call it, right? It's really stunning. It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And, but the thing here is with the ceiling, right, is that the star pattern across the sky is, there are things that are supposed to be on the left when you're looking up, and there are things that are supposed to be looking at the right. And when this was finished, I mean, nobody can doubt that it was beautiful, but somebody discovered that it was flopped 180 degrees about the way it should be looking when you're looking up into the sky. Now, I'm hard pressed. I wasn't there, but I'm hard pressed to think that that was actually something that was an intentional thing. I would hate to be the person looking at the drawing and then looking up at the finished product after all that and realizing that it was absolutely backwards. You see, so they had to come up with these crazy cover stories like, well, we wanted to make it's so magnificent. We wanted it to be true to form from when God was looking down on Grand Central, and then it would be correct, which to me sounds like a little bit of spin, just saying, okay? But it really is beautiful. Remember those abutments I was showing you in those earlier photographs before they built the entire city on top of the train tracks, right? And, I remember coming down here when I was a kid looking at this. I used to love this kind of stuff. I love anything mechanical like this. But this is the same stuff that's holding up the city from back in those early photographs I was showing you back from 1910. And there's the third rail, by the way. That's where you pick up the electricity. If I were you, I'd stay away from that. And the restored station. This goes out to Vanderbilt Hall. This is a ramp that goes up to 42nd Street to Vanderbilt Hall. And it's beautiful. And Vanderbilt Hall, what used to be the waiting room, right? And now you can actually rent Vanderbilt Hall if you want to. You rented that. I mean, if you could afford something like that, I suppose. I mean, you could have a bar mitzvah party there or something like that. That sounds pretty cool to me, Now, to the upper left of this photograph, do you see that little rectangle, that dark brown rectangle? Now, when they were done restoring this, the restorers specifically left this black rectangle or brown rectangle. And what that is showing you is what the original unrestored surface looked like. Isn't that dramatic? Isn't that something? That's how filthy it was. It's just unbelievable, right? They left that there as a reminder of how filthy it really was. Outside, you still have the same kind of archways here. Remember that all of the steel work here, it's not steel work, it's actually wrought iron. And they're using extensive use of the A19 lamps. And it's beautiful that they didn't try to modernize it with some other thing that would have completely changed the design. And the metal work here is before welding, so they had to put it together all with rivets. And it's a whole nother element of architectural ironwork to be able to create arches and things that have a functional purpose of holding something up, and yet have it still be beautiful with all of those rivets and everything else like that. If you don't know what I mean, if you travel the Merritt Parkway or under the Merritt Parkway in some of the underpasses, you can see some of the exposed architectural ironwork in the age of riveting, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And it's a quick trip. You can be in the city in no time. Come out here in Grand Central. You can walk down the street. There's the Chrysler Building right over there, right? It's a lovely day trip. And, you know, this is the entrance over here on 42nd Street, right over this structure right over here would be that Pershing Square arch going across 42nd Street. And, you know, when you walk through Vanderbilt Hall, you walk up this long ramp, and there are these oaken doors with these brass push handles that have been pushed so many times over the course of generations that where it says push has literally been worn off, you know? And as I come up that ramp, you know, I wind up with this kind of sense of connectedness. I like things that connect me to people who lived before me, in a sense that everything is so modern, everything is so postmodern. You know, if you've got a smartphone, you know that you know, you got to change it every couple of years because it's obsolete and all the rest of this. Everything's obsolete, you know, but it's comforting to me to have stuff that the way I'm doing it right now, the experience of walking up this ramp and pushing this door open is the same as it would have been from somebody in 1940, you know, and I just love that. And I go up that ramp and I push that door open, and then it hits me. The sounds of the city, all of the different languages, some of them where I don't even understand, the horns, the traffic, and then the smell of the food carts, where I grew up on dirty water hot dogs and pretzels and things like that. And I got to tell you, you know, it makes me feel like I've arrived at home. And I want to thank you for joining me today's presentation. This is my last slide. I hope that brought back some memories for you, or maybe you learned a couple of things or you enjoyed the photographs. I want to thank you for joining me in this architectural series. It's a privilege for me to spend an hour and a half with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you.
Now, does anybody have any questions that you want to put into the chat, or you can do the raise hand, or you can, you know, now that things have kind of taken a pause, you can also use your microphone and ask questions if you feel comfortable doing that. If you don't, put them into the chat and I'll read them out loud so you're not actually on the recording, or we would love to have you just, you know, speak to us. And as always, once the program ends, if you think of a question, a story, something that you want to relay to group for next time, always feel free to reply to that Zoom invitation, and you can send me those questions, those stories, and I'll either pass them on to Arthur or he can relay them at the next meeting so everybody can hear them. If there are no questions, comments, stories, I want to thank everybody sincerely for being with us today. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the Brooklyn Bridge. And again, on Monday, April 18th, we'll be talking about Ukraine. Everybody have a great afternoon. It was good to see you. Thank you so much, Arthur.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.